Today, Kyle and I are talking with our new friend and Microsoft security professional, Carl Johnson. Carl has over 22 years of experience working with SharePoint, Teams, Azure Information Protection, and data loss protection. And his focus is on high compliance and regulatory organization. Hello, Carl, and welcome.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Hey, it's Carl. So we are getting a lot of questions about CUI. So what are some of the pains and the challenges people are having in terms of handling of CUI?
That's a great question. I think most of the emails and the calls I receive is from federal contractors that are about to go through either CMMC or related to DFARS, and they're trying to understand how exactly they manage and organize all that information they've been accumulating over the years in an unstructured environment. Unstructured in a sense where it was just basically a network drive or inside of a SharePoint library with no kind of structure around it. So now they're concerned, how exactly do we manage this information from a regulatory perspective with CUI?
Okay, well, Carl, let's take a step back for a moment. What exactly is CUI?
Yeah. So CUI, which was first developed and created by the DoD, which stands for Controlled Unclassified Information. So as it relates to an organization, let's say you're a federal contractor, you have all these documents that are sitting in these libraries or in these folders, but there's no type of label or marketing. So we don't know whether or not the information is classified, or in this case unclassified, but it's specific to energy or specific to finance or export procedures. If you're a software company, or for instance, I deal with a lot of like aerospace companies, and they have to tell the government what exactly they're exporting to other countries, and then how they're marking those documents so it's related to that specific CUI or that specific regulatory DoD marking.
So Carl, you have a lot of experience on the marking and the labeling of CUI. So why do we need to mark and label CUIs, and what are some of the requirements?
Yeah, that's one of the questions that I get on a daily basis is, why do we have to do this, right?
Right.
Why is what we have right now, why isn't it, good enough? And really the biggest reason is, think from the perspective of the DoD, which is now putting the requirements that federal contractors now have to handle their, any information, whether it's classified or unclassified, and with more of with white gloves. From DoD's perspective, the reason why marking is important is that if an auditor comes into your organization, you should be able, within 10 to 15 minutes, be able to tell that auditor what information relates to confidential, what information relates to FOIA, or what we call for your eyes only, what information you're sharing with external parties outside your organization, especially if you're sharing with another DoD federal contractor, what in those details. But more importantly, you should be able to have a risk score associated by how much of these different documents you have. A great and short example is, if you're a federal contractor, and let's say you're working with FEMA, well, you might have a lot of information about if some type of cash payout or some type of information about a resident's first name, last name, their date of birth, maybe some PIA information. Well, all that information has to be classified in some way, so that there is no mistake that that information is does not go into the wrong hands, or people that are not authorized to see that information.
Well, specific to CUI marking and labeling, what are the biggest challenges?
Yeah, I think honestly, and I always relate back to behavior, right? Behavior of your users. We have tons of technology that, and even with AI, that does marketing very well. But before you could do any marketing, you have to train your staff on how to, one, identify what needs marking and what does not. For example, if you're creating a document and the user is starting the actual document itself, normally that's not a routine to say, okay, I have to mark or identify this document as classified, right? So the biggest challenge is, one, getting people involved and making sure that they understand the importance of marking and how that impacts the second, your company, but also the industry. And then the second challenge, the biggest challenge, is that what do you do with those thousands of documents that you've been, over the past 10, 15 years, that you've been storing, right? Where exactly is the line where it says that you no longer have to worry about marking archived documents? So those are the biggest challenges, and especially from a financial perspective, it takes a lot of resources to have to go back and mark all those documents that you had from 10, 15 years ago, and somebody has to do it.
Yeah. So with those big challenges about marking, can the CUI marking or labeling be done automatically? Is there a way to do it automatically?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, being with Microsoft for the last, 20-something years, and especially in the cybersecurity world, the biggest challenge is always, how do we automate as many tasks as possible? Think, for instance, like a form. The last thing you want is a user putting in form information because you don't know if it's going to be accurate. The same is true about markings. We can train, especially inside of AIP or Azure Information Protection, to scan the documents looking for identifiable information and make the determination of whether or not that should be marked. The second way, and I think is more of a best practice and something I always like to do, is that take a step back and create templates for your organization, so that even a basic document has already some type of marking, whether it's confidential, unclassified in some kind of level, financial, so that the user can't get around by creating documents that don't have markings to it. So by creating templates that run throughout your whole organization, no one can go and create just a regular blank document. They all have to select from one of the documents. So you can make it at the lowest level of classification, still protects your company, right? Rather than having none at all. And I think that's the best way to automate. But really, at the end of the day, it's about training and behavior, going back to the staff and telling them the importance of why we're doing this, even before you actually roll out a Azure Information Protection or labeling or marking program for your organization.
Yeah, I agree. Training is very important.
Carl, you could just please walk us through just a high-level process of what's involved with being able to do the automated CUI marking and labeling?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we were, doing a whiteboard session, and you invited me into your company, and with this challenge that you have, the first step, like anything, is to inventory. What exactly do we have, right, inside the organization? And if we're talking about a federal contractor, there might be many proposals, which are CUI, and depending on the stage of the proposal, there might be a lot of financial information, especially if we're going into DFARS and different things like that. So the first stage is inventory. Let's find out what you have, where we have many different scanners that gives us an idea of what's there. The second stage is we look at what Microsoft has built in, which Microsoft has done an amazing job, and I'm not just saying it because I work with Microsoft, but they've done an amazing job of creating labeling and markings templates, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. Whether we're talking about financial, agricultural, healthcare, especially if we're, HIPAA, work with a lot of companies that deal with HIPAA information, those labels are already built into Microsoft. So I may say to you, depending on your budget and depending on how much resources you have, I may say to you, let's use the built-in templates that Microsoft has already created for your labeling and your markings. If you're a larger organization, more into the medium to large, you're going to have a little bit more complex environment where you're going to need to create custom markings and custom labelings. So I'll give you an example. If you have a finance department, yes, you might have finance, but you also might have finance that deals with Europe or deals with Asia or deals with Australia, which all have different types of requirements when it comes to labeling and marking and obviously regulatory, and especially with Europe. Europe is probably ahead of most countries when it comes to making sure that the privacy of information is secure and that there is some kind of label marking. So we might create sub labels to help you with those other countries or help you with those other locales so that you and your organization can be ready to work that way.
Great. So you mentioned about the inventory. How is there a good way or easy way to actually do the inventory?
Yeah. Inventory is. It reminds me of back in the days when I worked at a supermarket, and they would say once or twice a year that we're going to inventory a whole entire store, and I would try to make sure I was off that day. It's kind of the same way when you're working with inventory of files that you've had for 10 to 15 years. It's not a task that everyone likes to do. What I always suggest and advise is that you want to get the business units themselves, the stakeholders themselves involved in inventorying their own information that they're responsible for. We could use tools and do scans, things like DLP and different things like that to do scans and figure out what's there. But to me, the best recipe is to first allow the users to identify the information. And I'm also a firm believer, if you can go ahead and delete it or remove it off your system, by all means do so. Don't be a hoarder of information if you don't need to be. Why are you keeping, information from 20 years ago? So in that inventory, the suggestion is go ahead and delete it. Let's purge it off the system, because that's also one less thing that you have to worry about, being part of an e-discovery or audit, things that is irrelevant to your business today. But that's honestly the recipe. We can use tools to scan, but you really want the users to be involved in this process and be able to tell you, these are the types of forms that we use, and so you can start seeing a pattern. The more I see a pattern, the more I can program my tools to look for those particular patterns as we scan and then we start to do our labeling process. But I really need the user's input first.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. Once you actually get into the deleting of CUI information, a lot of them is like, we keep everything. That's our business requirements. But when you actually start asking about what is the requirements from the contract, it's like, yeah, actually, we're not following those contract requirements yet.
Yep, exactly, absolutely. Right. And when you start to tell them how much time it's going to take itself, then they start to say, you know what, maybe it's really not all that important that we have all these files, this terabyte of data that we've been holding over these years.
Yes. So, Carl, what are some of the you mentioned about Microsoft 365 tools. So what are some of the Microsoft 365 tools that are good for CUI marking and the labeling?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I guess the first is, with everything, there is a lot of customers have, they're using Office 365 and they may be saying, well, maybe we have these tools already, but it's really like everything in this world. It's about licensing. So if you have, like a Microsoft E3 or E5 license, the Azure Information Protection itself is available and that you can enable it. It does require setup. It does require, some of the requirements and the planning in the beginning. But the ones I would recommend the most if we're talking about CUI and labeling and marking is that you want basically to go for Azure Information Protection. And then from there we'll enable it so to allow you to do your labels. And if you're an organization that has your own custom markings, or if you deal with the DoD or the Pentagon or Justice Department, you may have specific markings that you want to choose from and use. But that can all be done inside of Azure Information Protection. The actual technology is the simple part. It's the planning, the requirements. That part is the part that would really take time. Once we understand what you're trying to do, we've done this so many times, we would advise you on the best way and then go ahead and do the implementation for you and then teach you how to do it yourself as you grow and expand.
Carl, I'm curious, what can AIP, ULP, and Azure Rights Management do? Just what's some of the functionality of these platforms?
Yeah, sure. So for AIP, think of it, if we were doing whiteboard, I would think of these as three, let's just start with just two buckets, right? For your Azure Information Protection, its real goal there is to you think of it as more of the display and the encryption, right? So we're talking about putting the labels on the documents. And I keep using the word document, but what I mean by that is your Excel, your PowerPoint, your Word documents, your inside of your Exchange itself, any of these emails going back and forth, internal, external, all that in that whole tenant that you have requires some type of labeling, right? So that's the first part. The second part is, let's think of a scenario where you're sharing information outside your organization with a untrusted vendor, a vendor that you just started doing business with. Well, you don't know where that information is going. So you have encryption that is built into your AIP so that you make sure that only you and that person, that vendor that you're sharing information with, is going to be able to read that email. If that email, for some odd reason, gets into the wrong hands, it won't be able to be opened, right? Because there is encryption inside the email. And I think a lot of people believe, and I read this all the time, is that they believe that once it leaves your tenant, there's no longer any encryption, and that's not true. The encryption itself stays on that document. So if the other person doesn't have the right key, then that document will not be opened. So you're protected even down the years down the line, and something happens to that laptop or to that information. The second part that I would like to address is the DLP, which is data loss protection, right? So what we mean by data loss protection is, one, scanning your environment, looking for things such as your PII information, personal identity such as your social security number, date of birth, address. And nowadays that we live in this very social media kind of world, PII is expanded even more, right? So your geolocation, your username that you're using on Twitter, on Instagram, all that information itself, we're constantly scanning. And not only just for the protection of the user, but the protection of the organization, to make sure that no one is sharing out social security numbers, which I've seen many times, but they're sharing social security numbers or they're sharing date of birth information. Those are the two buckets that you really want to, wrap your heads around when we're talking about DLP and Azure Information Protection.
How about the unified labeling platform?
Yeah, I'm honestly very excited about unified labeling, and excited in the sense that most of my customers are dealing with GCC High, which is inside the government tenants for Microsoft and Office 365. Well, unified labeling was literally, as we speak, is being rolled out across all the tenants. Before, only commercial tenants had unified labeling. And so unified labeling is just allows you as an organization to have an umbrella of defense, right? Before, when you would have to have labeling that for your Word documents or your PowerPoint and things inside of Office, and then you had separate labeling inside of SharePoint, and then you might have another set of labeling inside of Teams, which is still part of SharePoint, but you still might have different labeling. Now, with unified labeling, your whole entire organization is protected. So kind of think of it that set it and forget it. We can create the labels, create our marketings at the high level of your organization, and that will trickle down through all the applications, the Microsoft applications that you're using. Mm-hmm. From background in SharePoint, I struggled in the early days of how trying to protect an organization that had labeling on their documents or inside their Office product, but then they had a totally separate labeling inside of SharePoint. So a lot of it was either redundant or it would kind of one cross the other out. And so now I can look at your organization and say, let's have a plan that we're going to protect everything inside of this tenant. And then we don't have your budget is a lot lower because you're not doing twice the amount of work. And two, you can sleep a little easier knowing that if you're sharing even through SharePoint externally, even that's protected the same way as if you're sharing it through Exchange by sending an email, right? The same protection is provided there. And so you make one change, you change everything in the organization.
How about Azure Rights Management? Are they all integrated into these platforms and products?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This, the rights protection over the years, Microsoft has really beefed up its ability to one by using AI, but two, being able to identify what exactly the organization itself is trying to protect, and use that as a template so that with rights protection, everything inside of the tenant is protected, but also when the information leaves the tenant, it's also protected. So you don't have to, kind of, again, like I mentioned earlier, worry about a one-sided protection. Everything is protected. The documents are protected. Devices, and I should probably name that more than anything else, right? You have a lot of people that now, BYOB, bring your own, BYOB, well, BYOB too, but bring your own devices, BYOD. Now all that information that you have on your phones, on these tablet devices, all that is now protected as well. So you no longer have to worry about, okay, that person that we terminated 2 weeks ago, he still has information on his phone that we need to get back. Well, now with rights protection, Azure Information Protection, DLP, all that allows you to protect everything that is your property as an organization.
So now we have all these technologies. How long will it take to implement all these Microsoft 365 tools that you just mentioned?
Yeah. So I guess
it's not a trick question.
Yeah, I was about to say it's. A consultant never tells you really how long. Give you maybe a roadmap or timeline. But it depends on how extensive you want the implementation to be, and also the complexity of it. If you're a SMB, a small medium business, within maybe 2 weeks. Right? I always like to spend time with the organization and understand how you do business, especially if you're dealing business with the government, whether it's civil or DOD, get an understanding of how you interact with different agencies, and that will allow me to create a template or a blueprint for you. And then, like I said, we can have at the very basic level within 2 weeks of interviews, stakeholders, configuration, 2 weeks. For a larger company, like let's say 500 users and above, That, I would say, you should probably plan for a good 3-month implementation. Not necessarily because of the technology, but more so because you have, or you may have, all types of data and information that needs to be examined, inventoried, understood, so we're making the right decision. And in any case, if the, especially if we want to automate labeling and automate markings, knowing and understanding, your typical documents that you use helps us basically create this template for you that you don't have to do anything, you meaning the users, don't have to do anything, and you allow Azure Information Protection to do all the heavy lifting and all the work.
Right.
So what are the more common AIP labels that DoD contractors would use?
Yep. I would say, for the most part, the one I see the most is FOIA, or for your eyes only. That's obviously when you're exchanging information, and let's say with a certain individual or inside of an agency, and you just want just those parties to see that information and no one else not to share it. Confidential, obviously, we've used that word so much, I think it's overused at times. But confidential not necessarily means from a DoD or federal perspective, but it might be confidential to your organization, right? Such as your financial information, HR information, information from marketing, proposals, different things like that. One that is specific to DoD, you might have a labeling, literally name, CUI or CUI, and then name the actual agency itself. So it allows, especially if you're dealing with multiple agencies, their definition may be a little different from one agency to another.